Hi everyone, this is lecture 15 for POS 273, International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So we've come to the end in this class, and this last lecture is just kind of a brief review of some of the terrain that we've covered, but really it's looking forward to talk about some of the ways in which you can use the conceptual tools that you have gained as a result of being in this class to understand international relations and global politics, and just some practical ways to think about how to continue to engage with international relations. It's a really important and consequential element of understanding the world in which we live, and I encourage you as much as possible not to think of this course as something you learn and you kind of finish and put down and don't pick up again, but the first step in a continuous process of being engaged with and understanding the world around you. So what we're going to cover today are basically those things. What are some of the concrete ways that you can employ the insights that you've gained in this class? I'll talk about some practical ways that you can continue to engage with IR in your own life. Just, things that you can do in your daily life, or things that you can plan to do, try to strive towards doing, that can help you better understand international relations and make this part of your life. And I'll close with why does this matter, which is a little bit of a retread from where we were at the very beginning of the class, but we'll talk about it once again. So first off, I want to pull from Dresner a little bit. In his book on zombie fiction and IR theory, he's talking about the contemporary state of international relations. And yes, the subject is zombies, right? But he's pulling out some insights that I think are important to keep in mind as you think about where we are right now in international relations. One of the things that he says is that we live in a less state-centric world, meaning that a lot of the modern understandings of international relations evolved from a set of assumptions that put the state as kind of the preeminent unit in international relations. If you wanted to understand IR, then basically you had to understand the state and how states interact. And that is becoming less the case, right? If we think about the most compelling and central issues to our global community today, very few of them reside exclusively within the state. So some of the most severe security threats that we face emanate from non-state actors. The threat of global climate change, which is probably the most consequential, most important challenge that we have to figure out as a human species, is not simply what states decide, but it's also what private actors decide, what corporations decide, what a variety of non-state actors are going to do as well. And on and on and on, right? Trade, security, the environment, all of these things involve a number of actors that are not the state. And so that creates challenges, because a lot of the theories that we have and the understandings, the predictions that we have made about IR have been based in the state. So that's a challenge, right? That's the world in which we reside, and that's one of the things that we're going to have to deal with. We have also shifted from a period in history which was relatively predictable, right? If we look at the post-World War II period, it was a relatively predictable period. We knew basically where different countries in the world stood, and we knew that tomorrow or next year that the state of alliances, the relationships, the nature of the interactions that were happening in IR were not going to change radically. And that has changed, right? That has changed to the point where, alliances and relationships seem to be more fluid. The predictability of our foreign policy and the foreign policy of other nations seems to be less consistent over time. And it's very hard to say in 10 or 15 years, what the world is going to look like. There's a lot that's in motion, and it's hard to tell. So that's another challenge that we face. Part of what's driving this is that we live in a more interconnected world. So this is not to say that previous periods in history weren't connected. There were dense networks and relationships, both politically and economically and socially, that existed prior to this contemporary period. But as we talked about with globalization, the speed, the scale, and the distance across which those connections flow has never been greater, and it's never been quicker. So we have a dense network of relationships that kind of operates on fast forward and can traverse very, very significant distances that, it was much harder to do before. So that introduces another challenge. But I wouldn't think of this only in terms of challenges. I think this is also a tremendous period of opportunity, right? What we see is that because of this different world in which we live, because of the changes that we've seen even over the last 10 years, there is a really desperate and compelling need for expertise, broad understanding, and also just creativity, the ability to be adaptive, the ability to be nimble and think about things in different ways. And so for students taking a class in international relations, that's what I encourage you to think about, is that the old octogenarians who have lots of experience and lots of wisdom in international affairs, lots of practical experience, and years of living and working in careers that have exposed them to international relations. Yes, they have knowledge, but they might not be that adaptive and that nimble. And so there really is a need for international relations, because these are crucial problems that we're talking about, really, significant problems that are going to require all hands on deck. There is a need for individuals who not only have the expertise and the understanding, but the ability to think adaptively. And so think of this brave new world, this uncertain new world, as one in which you can really make your mark. You can do something significant. So that's the first thing I would say. I want to shift gears to some of the things that Jennifer Sterling Foker says about thinking conceptually about IR, how to apply these different conceptual IR frameworks. And she lays out a number of really useful insights that, we've mentioned these, but I just want to lay them out one final time before you finish up the class. So we've talked about a lot of theories and a lot of concepts in this class. We've talked about a lot of different ways of conceptualizing and understanding how to approach world politics, international relations. But the key thing, and this is the very first thing that Jennifer Sterling Foker says in her chapter, is to resist the urge to start with theory. So if you like realism and you think realism is a comfortable, familiar framework that you enjoy applying, try to resist the urge to start with realism. Resist the urge to start with theory. Start with the issue. Start with the thing that you're interested in. Start with the thing that you want to understand, and then move to theory. So choose your problems on the basis of what you find interesting or important. Do not choose your problems on the basis of what seems to conform to the expectations and assumptions of a certain theoretical framework well. So the wrong way to do this would be to say, well, there was this period of thawing in U.S.-Russian relations after the Cold War, and then eventually we ended up with a more hostile set of relationships, and Russia began to behave in a more aggressive and confrontational way with the West. Realism seems to be a great framework to explain that. So because I'm a committed realist, I'm going to use this case of U.S.-Russian relations to lay out, an explanation rooted in realism. Don't do that, right? If you are interested in U.S.-Russian relations, start with that, right? Start with that, analyzing that question, right? But don't start with the theory and then say, what are the different things throughout the world that seem to fit within this theory, and then use it in that way. When you employ theory, right, when you want to utilize theory to explain and understand the world, try to zero in on very specific events or actions, right? So instead of saying, well, how does globalization impact the world? That's an impossibly huge question, right? What you could say is, how have U.S. trade relations with Western Europe changed since the 1990s? Right? That's a more manageable question. That's something that you can zero in on. You can really focus on specific bits of information and hopefully say something that's relatively concise and coherent, and using some of these theoretical tools make a compelling case for whatever you want to argue in relation to that question. So when employing theory, try to zero in on specific events or actions, specific foreign policy decisions, that sort of thing, as opposed to broad amorphous trends that are very hard to pin down. And as you look at them, you want to ask, what is the puzzle or the question? Try to frame it as a question or some sort of puzzle that needs to be unpacked, right? In particular, things that are interesting to look at, if you look at one period in history and then there seems to be some sort of change in foreign policy or how states interact with one another, that in and of itself is a puzzle. Trying to explain change in international relations is a puzzle, and that can be really useful and worthwhile to try to unpack. In addition, you want to think about things that are unexpected, right? So, the U.S. All of a sudden having a one-on-one meeting with the leader of North Korea. That's unexpected, right? Nobody would have said 6 months ago that they thought Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un were going to sit down and have lunch with one another. So how do you explain that? How do you explain that change that nobody necessarily expected? What structural conditions, what individual level conditions, decisions of individuals and the ways that they interpret the world, what changed there to make that possible? And then as you use different theories, try to think about some key aspects of those theories. So what would the focus be? What are they going to view as the key variables if you're using this framework? What level of analysis matters? So are you looking at the international system? Are you looking at regional organizations? Are you looking at domestic politics, some of the things we've been talking about recently in this class? Or maybe you go right down to the individual level and your explanation is primarily driven by the individual characteristics and psychological dispositions of leaders. Those things matter, right? And they merit consideration because you have to think about what is the information that you're going to utilize to try to understand your question. Methodology, so what is the systematic way that you try to investigate this, and what evidence does it produce? And then lastly, you want to think about conclusions. What are the conclusions that you draw from using a different conceptual framework? The big caveat that I would put here, and Jennifer Sterling Foker talks about this in her chapter 2, is try to resist certainty. In general, certainty is kind of dangerous in international relations because no theory, no conceptual framework ever explains something completely and in its totality. And if you try to make predictions in which you're too certain, then you can end up looking pretty foolish. So intellectual humility is important when you're trying to understand international relations because you're dealing with so much complex, unfolding information. You kind of have to be adaptive, not only in how you understand it, but just how you project that understanding outwards. All right. So I also want to talk about some practical ways to engage in international relations. If you're interested in global politics, if you're interested in the world around you, the world outside your little town or community, or even outside your country, there are some practical ways that you can try to remain engaged with international relations. The first thing I would say is try to be knowledgeable about global affairs. Americans, in part because of intellectual laziness, but also in part because of the fact that we live in such a huge country to begin with, we tend to not be very knowledgeable about global affairs, but there's really no excuse for that, right? Subscribe to a Google News alert for some international topic that you're concerned about. There's all sorts of great podcasts that are just daily or periodic digests of what's happening in the world. BBC News has a global news podcast that comes out every day. It's about half hour, 45 minutes. You can just listen to it in the morning as you're going to the gym or driving to work. And that really gives you a tremendous overview of what's happening in the world. And it doesn't take much effort, right? It really doesn't take too much work to have some sense of what's happening in the world. And we kind of have a responsibility to understand what's happening in the world. And if we care about it, if we're interested in other parts of the world, there's more information out there about what's happening in the world than there ever has been. So find some news outlets that you trust and See what's on the world page every day or every other day, or subscribe to a podcast that delves into some of these issues. Just try to be knowledgeable about what's happening in the world. The second thing I would say is travel. Travel as much as you can. Travel to places that seem interesting to you. Travel to places that, maybe you don't understand the culture very well or speak the language very well, but you want to go there. And travel is expensive, right? Travel is expensive. It's hard if you have, a job and kids and things like that. But do your best to make the sorts of sacrifices that enable you to travel and see the world. Even if it's not as much as you would like, you're not some jet setter that's backpacking around the world, try to go to places that interest you and actually see firsthand what's there and interact with the people, with the locals firsthand, and really go with a sense of curiosity and interest. Similar to that, I would say learn a language. Again, Americans tend not to have any language skills beyond English, right? Or very few do. But there's tremendous insight that can be gained from learning a language. You learn a lot about a culture when you can speak its language. And it also enables you to interact with people from that culture and really kind of interact with them on their own terms. I would also just say, like, strategically speaking, that if you want a job for an NGO that deals with international affairs, or you want to work in an international organization, you want to go work for the UN, you really need to have at least a second language, potentially more than that. And there's, again, all sorts of tools to enable you to do that. Beyond that, seek out engagement with other cultures and identities. So this does not involve necessarily getting on a plane. We have a very diverse and rich multicultural fabric of identities in the United States. And when you meet somebody who's come here from another country, try to learn about their experience. Try to learn about what things were like in their other country. If you meet somebody that's here traveling, an international student that's here to study, ask them questions about their country. And it won't feel invasive and it won't feel rude if you're coming from a place of genuine curiosity and respect. And it's a very important and valuable way to learn about other cultures and identities. And then lastly, I would say engage in kind of an international relations self-audit. So all of us every day are engaged in actions that we might not think about it at the time, but they are bound up in other cultures, other political systems, the decisions of international organizations. This could be something as simple as, going to Target and buying a shirt that's made somewhere else. And you think about how that shirt was produced, the supply chain that eventually got it to you, et cetera, et cetera. So those sorts of things, whether it's as a consumer, whether it's the political decisions you're making, be conscious and cognizant of the ways that they are bound up with what is happening in the rest of the world, and try to periodically kind of reflect on that. So there are practical ways that you can engage with IR, even if you're not going to end up, working overseas or something like that. But just, by being kind of a more intentional and conscious human, you can think about the ways that these international interactions are happening, sometimes even within our own societies. Lastly, why this matters. So this is going to be kind of a rehash of some things that I said at the outset of the class, but I think in particular for an IR class taught in an American university, you have to recognize the privilege and power that the United States has in our current configuration, our current international system. So we have tremendous power. We have the largest military in the world. We have an extremely large and powerful economy. We have relationships and alliances with virtually every country in the world. And we exist in a position of privilege. We exist in a position in which if something needs to change internationally, the United States has the capability to do it or to work with allies to ensure that it happens. Whereas individuals in other countries don't have that luxury, right? They are not in positions of privilege and power. They are in positions of much less privilege and power relative to the United States. So that gives us kind of a responsibility to use that to the extent that we can responsibly, right? We can help shape the image that we project out into the world, what specifically you think that should be, whether it's, a tough militaristic image, or you think it's something more compassionate and kind. It doesn't really matter, but you can help to shape that image, right? You can help to elect the leaders and create the structures that project our image out into the world. And you also are sort of a cultural ambassador, right? So if you're meeting somebody from another country, you are representing the United States and everything that we represent. You get to make decisions about the leaders and the political elites who craft our foreign policy. And we're also consumers. We have a tremendous amount of consumer power in the United States. And so we're making decisions about what we buy, what we consume. And that has implications for global politics. As I said at the outset of the class, doing those things responsibly, doing those things well, presupposes knowledge, right? So we have to be knowledgeable, and we have to be systematic in how we make sense of the deluge of information that comes at us from the world around us at any given moment, right? How do we make sense of what is happening in the world and think about what we ought to be doing, what our role in the world ought to be? And so this class, I hope, has been a starting point in thinking systematically and having the tools to make sense of information that can be overwhelming, confusing, and a little bit debilitating, right? Just because there's so much happening in the world. But hopefully, my hope is that you leave this class with a basic understanding of how countries interact, and some of the things that happen at the global level with regard to interactions in economic, environmental, political, social dimensions of our global community, and some sense of how to systematically analyze that and try to explain, to offer explanations for what's happening or predictions for what might happen in the future. So I wish all of you the best of luck. I hope you'll remain engaged with international relations, and this will be something that just becomes part of your daily routine, right? Thinking about global politics and what's happening in the world. And I hope that you've gained some tools to help you do that in a way that enriches your understanding. So I hope you've enjoyed the class, and thanks very much for this compressed semester in which I hope that you learned a lot. Thanks.